Jesus' name. Amen. Some of these verses will be familiar, I'm sure, fairly familiar to you. For example, verse 23, we sang a hymn based on that verse, but there's a new section marked above us here, verses 21 to 28, and it begins with verse 21, where Jeremiah, as I've said, looking back, he said, "This I recall to my mind. This I recall to my mind. Therefore, I have hope." It's interesting how different cultures view and celebrate the new year. The Chinese New Year, for example, it's celebrated with fireworks, and I'm sure there's a level of entertainment with that, but the main reason that they celebrate the new year with fireworks is actually a pagan and religious one. It's to drive away and to destroy all of the bad spirits or evil spirits of the current year, the year that's closing. In some parts of Italy, on New Year's Eve, they have a very interesting celebration where it's out with the old and in with the new, and they would take lots of old things, not just clothes, but even old pots and pans and various devices, implements, whatever, and they just take them to the skip, to the dump, and that is a way of beginning anew. Centuries ago, in fact millennia ago, the ancient Romans, they celebrated it with the birth of the god Janus. Now, not Janus, but Janus. It's where we actually get the name January from. It's made up of the Roman god Janus. And Janus was the Roman god of new beginnings, transitions, and endings. It was a very interesting pagan god because it had two faces on it. And one face looked ahead, and the other face looked behind. Of course, you can see there then the thought of looking ahead, looking forwards, but also looking backwards. As we come to the end of an old year and fast approach January in a few days' time, it does various things, but it causes us to look backwards, doesn't it? To look backwards into all that God has done for us in the past year, and then to look out ahead into the year 2026 and to what God has in store for us. Now, this is essentially where Jeremiah is. And he's predominantly looking back in the book of Lamentations. He's looking back at all that has happened to Jerusalem. Some commentators do believe that the book of Lamentations was actually written about a quarter of the way in through Jeremiah's long prophetic ministry. So about 11 years in, Josiah, he passed away. Josiah saw revival, as I said. And some believe that he looked back with lamentation, lamenting that this godly young man had passed away, and all of the revival embers, it seems, were beginning to dissipate. But the vast majority of commentators, myself, I also feel this way, that really it makes more sense to think about it as him writing after all of his long ministry, his long 40-year ministry. You think of it, all that he had seen, revival in the early quarter of his ministry, as I've said. But then things gradually began to get worse and worse when you had the reigns of Jehoiakim with an N, and then Jehoiakim with an M, and then latterly and towards the end of Israel's existence, really, in terms of them existing in the way that they did. Zedekiah's reign then, the last 11 years of Zedekiah's reign as well. So he has seen it all. He has seen the good days of revival, but he has also seen days of decline, days of the apostatizing of the nation, and he has even seen his beloved Jerusalem burned down and the temple completely destroyed. He has even viewed a king have his eyes put out and taken as captive to Babylon. Now, after the destruction of Jerusalem, towards the end of the book of Jeremiah, you begin to understand what happens in the story or in the narrative. Jeremiah the prophet, he's taken with many other Jews to a city called Ramah. It's also where Samuel was born, the prophet Samuel. And he was set free by the Babylonians. So Jeremiah was not taken as a captive by the Babylonians. He was given a choice, essentially. Go with the vast majority of your people to Babylon and be with them and minister to them, or stay with the very tiny remnant under the jurisdiction of a man named Gedaliah, which you read of in chapters 40 and 41 of the book of Jeremiah. And you just think about that. All of the destruction, all of the devastation. I don't know what you would choose if you had the choice, but Jeremiah chose to stay with a very tiny remnant in and around the confines of the south of Israel, in Judah, and he actually stayed in a little town called Mizpah. And it seems that from Mizpah, as he begins to settle with this handful of remnant, looking back and looking at all of the destruction, all of the devastation, all of the disappointment, he then takes up his pen and begins to prophesy and write and recall the book of Lamentations. And that's why I said this section is very interesting in verse 21 and following, because we see here, he's in this kind of a spirit of looking back. Verse 21, this I recall to my mind. I'm thinking about it all. I'm thinking about the years of encouragement, the good years, the years under Josiah, but I'm also thinking about all of the devastation that my people have incurred and encountered. This I recall to mind. However, he doesn't have his eye focused on all of the difficulty and all of the nastiness of essentially the last 30 years of his life, all of the hardship, all of the decline. Because as he recalls this to his mind, he goes on in verse 21 to make this most amazing and astounding statement. This I recall to my mind. 30 years of decline, 30 years of apostasy, 30 years of watching the nation lose faith and heart. Yet, this I recall to my mind. Therefore I have hope. You see, what you see here in Jeremiah is that he's not looking at everything that's happening around him. His eye is not on that. His eye is on a faithful and merciful God. That is why he's able to say in verse 23, the well-known words that we have sang, we have read today, great is thy faithfulness, Lord. Lord, in the past 40 years of my life, as my life has taken this direction, I was to be a priest, but I'm now called to be a prophet. I have declared the word of God in all of its counsel. God, you've been faithful to me. Even the times whenever he was punched by a priest named Pashur, even the times when the king had put him in the stocks and he was made a derision for the people, even whenever he was thrown into a dungeon, as you read of there in chapters 38 and 39, and a man named Ebed-Melech, a king's servant, had to come and rescue him, even in spite of all of the hardship and all of the discouragement that he has seen, this I recall to mind, therefore I have hope. His hope is in the Lord and in the wonderful faithfulness of God. Folks, as we look back at the past year, undoubtedly there have been hurts, undoubtedly there have been hurdles, undoubtedly there have been discouragements and disappointments and even doubtings. Yet when you recall to your mind the tender mercies of God, the strength of God, the faithfulness of God to see you right here at the cusp of a new year, you must agree with Jeremiah, although all may not be well in the external circumstances of life, this you recall to mind. You recall to mind the faithfulness of God. Therefore, you have hope. You have hope because your hope is in an unchanging and an everlasting and an all-compassionate God. So let's take some various looks with Jeremiah as he's looking back really at his life and all that God has done for him. We want to take a backward look, we want to take an upward look, we want to take an inward look, and then we want to take a forward look with Jeremiah in these verses. So first of all, verse 21, let's take a backward look, a look at consideration, a look of consideration as we think of Jeremiah here. A backward look, a look of consideration. Verse 21, this I recall to my mind, therefore have I hope. What is it that Jeremiah is recalling to mind? Well, as I've said and intimated already, it's not the affliction and the misery of the past. Now, undoubtedly, in the 40 years that Jeremiah has prophesied to Judah, to Jerusalem, to the city of Jerusalem, there's been an awful lot of hardship and heartache and misery. And at times when you read through this book, you see that. There are times when he says that all of the billows and waves and sorrows, they've gone over my head. It's been too much for him. You even look at verse 18, for example, of this chapter. "I said, my strength and my hope is perished from the Lord." There were times whenever he felt as though he could not go on. And yet generally the tenor of these verses, verses 21 through to 28, really the tender mercies of God and the faithfulness of God and the fact that God has remembered him is in view. Remember, with the naked eye, all he sees is despair. He sees his beloved Jerusalem destroyed. He sees the temple, the house of God, completely ransacked. He wasn't looking at a building site. He was looking at a demolition site, folks. There was nothing to encourage him in terms of the future externally. And yet as he looks back, what does he remember? What is he recalling to give him hope for what is to come? It's this simple fact that in the midst of it all, God has remembered his people. Even the little handful of a remnant of people that you barely read of in the Old Testament that really existed from the time when the people of God, the vast majority of them, went to Babylon and then returned then, there was a little handful, a little remnant that stayed in Jerusalem with Jeremiah. You hardly read of them in Scripture. There's nothing to encourage him numerically with this handful of people. And yet in this handful of people, what does he see? He sees God remembering his own. He sees God being faithful to even his faithless people at times. And that's really the tenor of verse 21. In the midst of all of our unfaithfulness, in the midst of the decline of the people, in the midst of the sin of the people, in the midst of them giving their hearts to the various gods and goddesses of the time, the goddess of Ashtaroth, the fertility god, the god of Balaam, the worshipping of the various gods in the high places privately, the people have not been faithful. But God has remembered his own nonetheless. And that's why he says this, I recall to mind. He's generally in verse 21, he's looking back generally. And he has hope because God has not forgotten his people. And folks, we have to acquiesce and agree with Jeremiah here that in spite of our sin, in spite of your sin, in spite of all of your neglect at times of God, in spite of generally the general compromise or apostatizing of the church of Jesus Christ, yet God has not forsaken his own. God has remembered his own. God has preserved for him a remnant. God has preserved for him a seed here, even in this land. And even our congregation is in large part a testimony to the fact that God still remembers his own. And therefore, as you recall this to mind, child of God, generally, it's not a license to sin. It's not a license to turn the grace of God into lasciviousness and say we can do what we want, we can behave how we like. Of course not. But nonetheless, it is a reminder to us all that God is faithful. And God remembers his own covenant elect people. He has remembered them in the past, and he remembers them in the years, in the months, in the decades, in the whatever, the centuries that are to come. We see his grace, we see his purpose, we see his sovereignty, and therefore we come to the conclusion of Jeremiah, this we recall to mind, therefore we have hope. There's so many times when the psalmist does this in prayer. Psalm 136, for example, fairly well-known psalm because the refrain of virtually every verse is this, is that his mercy endureth forever. No matter where God's people were, no matter how they were, his mercy endures forever. Verses 12 and 13 of the psalm speak of how he led the people through the Red Sea in verses 12 and 13. Psalm 136, to him which divided the Red Sea into parts, for his mercy endureth forever, and made Israel to pass through the midst of it, for his mercy endureth forever. Now you think about that. What did God do? God came to his people who were in affliction for 400 years. His people that were in bondage. And what did he do? His mercy was displayed to them. He remembered them. He remembered his own people, even in the midst of Egypt and all that they were going through. And in due time, when the fullness of the time was come, God came and God redeemed them and God set them free. We remember this, folks. God generally and God everlastingly does not forsake his own. Spurgeon said that memory is the handmaid of faith. When we remember what God has done, we trust him for what he will do. And that's so true. So often we complain about the memories and all of that, but when we remember that God has remembered us, it's like a handmaid, it's like a servant of faith that encourages our faith. Elizabeth Elliot, the wife of Jim Elliot, who of course died as a missionary to the Auca Indians, she said, "Hope is not born in ease. It is born when we remember who God has been in the storm." And that's where Jeremiah is in this first verse of verse 21. He's taking a look backward, and it's a look of consideration. He's considering God's remembering his own. But he doesn't stop. He doesn't just continue on in memory lane. He doesn't just look back. But then verses 22 and 23, I want you to see that he now takes an upward look. A look of expectation. A backward look, a look of consideration, but an upward look, a look of expectation. Verses 22 and 23, "It is all the Lord's mercies were not consumed, because his compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness." In verse 22, he sees God's mercifulness. God's mercifulness. Again, let me invite you to just stand with Jeremiah and enter into all that he sees. He sees all that really is the center of the spiritual welfare of Israel, and he sees it in ruins. The beloved temple, the temple of the Jews, the temple of Israel. You remember when Nebuchadnezzar went into the temple and his armies, and how they treated it with such disdain, and how they took from it the treasures from it and the various implements, and how you just treated the temple not the way it ought to be treated at all. And then as Jeremiah lifted up his head, what does he see? He sees remember the gates around Jerusalem and the walls. Jerusalem was a fortified city. A couple of 100 years previous, it had proved this. Remember, the Assyrians came and they took the vast majority of Israel, the northern sort of 10 tribes of Israel, under the reign of Sennacherib, the king of Assyria. And remember how they encamped outside Jerusalem during the days of Hezekiah, and Hezekiah spread the need before God. And remember that the walls remained intact then, but not now, because the walls have been broken down. Nehemiah 1 verse 1 describes it this way: the walls have been broken down, the gates thereof burning with fire. He just sees a complete wreckage, a complete ruin. And yet, what is Jeremiah's response to say? Verse 22. "It's all the Lord's mercies we are not consumed." Some were consumed. Some were killed. But he's speaking here about this remnant now, isn't he? How God has preserved his remnant, how God has kept this people, even himself. There's undoubtedly, he's meditating on the mercifulness of God here. It's of the Lord's mercies that I am not consumed, that this little handful is not consumed, that the people of God, yes, they're in Babylon, rightly and justly and deservedly, but they're not consumed. And then he goes on to say in verse 22, "His compassions, they fail not." Now the term "fail not" in the Old and the New Testament, obviously different original languages, but they mean the same thing. And really the idea there is of them wearing away or wasting away or failing away. You think of something gradually being worn down. Think, for example, of you have a water and it's a tap, and it's leaking, or some form of water that's dripping, and it just wears away very gradually whatever it falls on. That's the thought here. God's compassions are not like that. They don't just gradually fail or wear away or dissipate, because God's compassion and God's love is forever. It's unchanging. It's eternal. And whenever we look back, yes, we see God remembering his own, but when we look upwards, what do we see? We see, yes, the fact that at times our compassions fail. Our love at times it's up here, other times it's down there, isn't it, child of God? Our love for God and our love for our fellow man. But God's compassions fail not. And as you look backward at the old year and we look upward, as it were, what do we see? We see a merciful God. It is by God's grace that we are not consumed. In a spiritual sense, consumed by the devil, consumed by the world and all that it has to offer, and even in a physical and tangible sense, it is of the mercies, the Lord's mercies, and of his everlasting and eternal love that we are here today. That by God's grace we can look out into 2026 and we're not consumed. We look upward, and in verse 22 we see the mercifulness of God, God's mercifulness, but we also see, verse 23, God's faithfulness. They're new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. Again, just to go back to the image of Jeremiah looking at everything. It's very hard to really enter into the spirit of Jeremiah because, as I said, 150 to 200 years ago historically, Israel had been taken captive by the Assyrians. And the vast majority of Israel were under the heel of Sennacherib in Assyria, and then even in that stage they kind of warped into Babylon, and there was a mongrel kind of a race for a collection of years and decades. But even at that time, Judah remained intact. Jerusalem, the city of Zion, remained intact. The temple remained intact. But now this is different. Now Zion's gone. Now Jerusalem is destroyed. Now the temple is no longer. And this would have ripped the heart, spiritually speaking, out of Jeremiah. Because at least centuries ago, they still had the house of God. They still had the joy of meeting with God. They had the joy of offering sacrifice, of knowing the joy of sins forgiven. To kind of, and I use this kind of very reluctantly, but Jerusalem was to Israel what Mecca is to Islam. That's the kind of, to put it into how much they invested in Jerusalem, in the temple. It was the Holy Grail. It was the holy place. But now Jerusalem is gone. The temple is destroyed. Jeremiah, if he looked around, his heart would have left him. His heart would have failed him. And at times this happened. As I've said, he mentions this in these verses in this chapter. And yet what does he encourage himself in? The fact that God has been faithful every day. Verse 23. They're new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Lord, every morning I have wakened up and I have faced hardship and I have faced difficulty. I have faced the people turning their backs on me because they've turned their back on you. I have faced harsh treatment. I have faced slander. I have faced lying. I have faced everything Jeremiah is saying here. But every morning, every day that he has raised himself, God has been faithful. Great is thy faithfulness. And folks, yes, we can look back and we see God remembering his own, but when we look up, what do we see? We see the tender mercies and the faithfulness of God. And you could write over this past year, no matter what you have come through, Lord, you've been merciful, and Lord, you've been faithful. Great is your faithfulness, Lord. D.L. Moody said that God's mercy is an ocean that cannot be drained and a river that never runs dry. And that's so true. Hudson Taylor faced many challenges in China. He faced hunger. He went days without barely anything to eat. He faced thirst in the extreme sense. He faced a lot of sickness. The climate in China, of course, was warm and humid and sticky. He faced bereavement. He lost his family in China. And yet every day, a great while before the sun would rise, he would get into either his little tent, which he often stayed in, or sometimes he stayed in like a canal boat kind of a thing, and he would have hidden there. And a great while before day, he always lit his little candle when it was dark. He got out his Testament, and someone asked him about that practice every day, and he said this: I do it every morning because every morning I meet with a faithful God. He met with a faithful God. And folks, it's the same with you and I. We don't have to take the extreme communistic China. You don't have to be there to see the fact that every day, morning by morning, you meet with a faithful God. So a backward look, a look of consideration. An upward look, a look of expectation. Thirdly, I want you to take an inward look with me, a look of recognition. An inward look, a look of recognition. Verses 24 and 25. The Lord is my portion, saith my soul, therefore will I hope in him. The Lord is good to them that wait for him, to the soul that seeketh him. The language of verses 21 through 23, he does have Israel more in mind. Yes, he has himself, obviously, the faithfulness of God, etc. But now, verse 24 especially, that there's this inward look, isn't there? It's not just Israel, but it's me, it's my. The Lord is my portion. Therefore, I will hope in him. It's not just general hope, the hope of the nation, but it's him. It's personal. He's my portion. Therefore, I will hope in him. Now, let me ask you a question. Did you ever talk to your soul? I don't mean speak of your soul, but I mean talk to your soul. You say, what are you talking about? Well, when you read the Psalms, you often read of David talking to his soul. What does David do whenever is it 1 Samuel, it speaks of David encouraging himself in the Lord, or maybe 2 Samuel? He's talking to his soul. And I believe that's what Jeremiah is doing here in verse 24. The Lord is my portion. Therefore, I will hope in him. He's not just talking to anybody else. He's encouraging himself in the Lord. He's taking an inward look, and he's reminding himself inwardly what he has in the Lord. And when you think of everything that he has already spoken of generally, the mercifulness of God, verse 21, the faithfulness, verse 22, the faithfulness of God, that general thought of God remembering his own, verse 21, then he has every right to say in verse 24 that the Lord's my portion, the Lord's my everything. He is everything to me. That's really what he's saying. And as he takes this inward look, at times in verse 18 he's been discouraged and he's looked at himself. But whenever he looks within and he looks at the fact that what we have sang today, that God is the treasure of his soul, he then says again in verse 24, already saying in verse 21, therefore I have hope. So in verse 24, as he recognizes what the Lord has been, as he takes this inward look, in verse 25 then, he resolves to do something, doesn't he? Verse 25, the Lord's good to them that wait for him, to the soul that seeketh him. So what he's really doing here in verse 25, in light of all that God is to him, the fact that he is his hope, he's resolving to wait on him and to seek after him. Now, the two verbs there, they are slightly different in what they're getting at. The thought of waiting there, the thought is of waiting in the sense of patiently waiting, just waiting to see what God will do. It's taking the step back. Let's see how all this unfolds. We're in, the people of God are in Babylon. I'm here with this remnant in Mizpah. I'm living here now. Things aren't the way I thought, the way I felt. Let's see what God would do. That's what it's speaking of there when the thought is of expectation. But in verse 25 then, it speaks of that more active seeking after him. Lord, I'm going to seek you. I'm going to wait on you, yes, expectantly, but I'm also going to seek you for you to intervene on our behalf, on my behalf, on the Lord's people's behalf, on behalf of this remnant. He didn't tell his soul all of the discouragement that was around him. When he had this talk to his soul, he reminded his soul himself that he had God as his hope, as his expectation. Martin Lloyd-Jones said this, folks, just to show you that I'm not crazy when I'm talking about talking to your soul. Martin Lloyd-Jones, a very reformed individual as well, said, talk to your soul more about God, more than you talk to yourself about your problems. Isn't that so often the case? Some problem arises. If you're anything like myself, you talk to yourself. So talking to yourself is apparently a sign that you're a genius, but anyway. But you know, we mutter to ourselves, we talk to ourselves, we think to ourselves, don't we? We meditate on all of the problems and all of the things and how they have panned out. And undoubtedly Jeremiah did that, we've seen that, but here especially in this portion, as he's recalling to mind the goodness of God, he says, God is my everything, the Lord is my portion. I have him as everything in the midst of all of this destruction and discouragement. Therefore, I will hope in him. And not only will I hope in him, but I will wait in him to change the situation, to move in the situation. And more than that, I'm not just waiting around passively, but I'm actively seeking him to intervene. And folks, that is the spirit of the Christian. We wait patiently for the Lord to work, but at the same time, we don't wait passively. We wait patiently, not passively, but then we actively pursue him and we seek after him. And as you look back, perhaps this year you haven't sought after him the way you should have. Perhaps you've just been more passive in waiting for things to pan out. But this year then, as Jeremiah says, because I have the Lord, therefore I will hope in him. Actively pursue him in a way that you didn't this past year. Therefore I will seek after him. Seek after him for the lost. Seek after him for souls, for the souls of your family, for the souls of those that you live with and work with on a daily basis, for the souls of this community and this locality. Because we have this hope in God, because God has been so good to us, he's been so faithful and merciful to us, it's of his mercies that we're not consumed. Therefore, Lord, we persevere, we pursue, we seek after you, that others will not be consumed. Psalm 34 verse 10 says, the young lions do lack and suffer hunger, but they that seek the Lord will not want any good thing. There are certain animals and they at times go hungry, but the Lord's people, as the apex of his creation, the Lord's people, we will not want any good thing if we walk with him. A backward look, an upward look, an inward look. Lastly, a forward look. A look of anticipation. Verses 26 and 27. It's good that a man should both hope and quietly wait for the salvation of the Lord. It's good for a man that he bear the yoke in his youth. Jeremiah, if only he was looking with eyes, there wouldn't be much hope, would there? Let's face it. He sees a pagan regime in Babylon. He sees a very cruel man, Nebuchadnezzar, at the helm. And yet as he has taken these backward and upward and even inward looks, he is encouraged to hope in the Lord. And that's why he says, just rounding off this kind of a section and thought, verse 26, of course, it's good for me to hope in the Lord. It's a good thing for me. It's a good thing for me to quietly wait for the salvation of the Lord. And the term salvation there is deliverance. It's a good thing. And so what he's really doing here, as he looks forward, he is resolving to wait on and to see God work and to see God move. To wait for the salvation of God. And undoubtedly he's looking on realistically, verse 27. It's a good thing that a man should bear the yoke in his youth. Lord, undoubtedly, as I look out, there's going to be the yoke, there's going to be hardship, there's going to be more difficulty. After all, he's come through 30, 35, 40 years of it already. And it's been a good thing for him to bear the yoke in his youth, in his tender years. That really was the life of Jeremiah. He was called to be a prophet, probably in his late teens. He bore the yoke in his youth. And so he looks out, and he just simply rounds it all off by saying, as I look forward, I don't know what lies ahead of me, Lord, but it's a good thing for me to wait and to bear and to seek after you patiently. And undoubtedly there will be afflictions, but Lord, give me grace to wait on. To wait on. Child of God, don't look at this year to come through the lenses of verse 18. Look at this year to come with the spirit of Jeremiah here in verses 26 and 27. Undoubtedly there will be hurdles and challenges. It'd be lovely if we could say 2026 would have absolutely no problems in life, no problems in church, no difficulties, no hardship. It would be wonderful. But God says here it's good. It's good that we bear affliction. It's good that we bear our yoke, the yoke in our youth, so that it will make us more patient, so that it will cause you to appreciate what you already have and cause you to further seek after the Lord. That's what affliction does, doesn't it, child of God? It works in you patience, as the book of James tells us. Tribulation worketh patience, and patience endurance. Don't look at this year through the eyes of verse 18, but rather verse 21. This I recall to mind. Therefore I have hope. And I trust that as we have taking these looks backwards, upwards, inwards, and forwards, that we will be enabled to trust the Lord for the future, as he has done in the past.